while I was gone, this trip that I just got back from, one of the things I did was give the keynote talk at the state convention of the Green Party of New Jersey. So we do have that video. It's not very long, so we're going to play that during the last chunk of the post game, or of the main show rather.
Green Horizon has chronicled the ups and downs of the movement in our state and nationally. Production of the magazine was sustained for 20 years because you probably all have heard my co-editor John Resenbrink over the years talk at one or another Green convention, but John, as you know, died 2 years ago. And the funding has been kind of drying up for Green Horizon. So next year, I'm going to transition into helping produce a new national periodical, working with Howie Morgan and others. An aspiration would be to do for the green politics movement what Jacobin magazine has done for the democratic socialist movement over the last 10 years. It's been outstanding. I don't know how many of you read Jacobin, but I read it all the time online. And we're fortunate today to have one of the most prominent columnists of Jacobin as our keynote speaker. Ben Burgis is an adjunct philosophy professor at Rutgers and also the host of the YouTube podcast, Give Them an Argument. But many of us have primarily been influenced by his articles in Jacobin, which are often relevant to our Green Party work. For example, a couple of weeks ago, his article was titled, Democratic Party Voters Are Furious About U.S. Support for Israel, where he discussed the uncommitted vote movement. Last week, his article was, Pro-Palestine protesters are on the right side of history. And this week, his article is titled, Freedom Under Capitalism Isn't All It's Cracked Up to Be, in which he critiques libertarianism, our ideological rival in the third party activist space. So I'm pleased to present our friend and movement comrade, Ben Burgis.
First things first, I want to thank you guys for the kind invitation to come speak to you, and Steve in particular for setting this up. I got the sense in my correspondence with him that part of what caused attention was a couple of things that I've written for Jacobin about the upcoming election. In particular, a couple of articles where I hammered home the point that as little as I may want Donald Trump to return to the White House, if Joe Biden loses the election this November because crucial constituencies he needs to win are discussed with the atrocities in Gaza, then the single person who deserves the most blame for that outcome is Joe Biden. It's the job of politicians to appeal to voters, and all of these liberal pundits raging at voters because they refuse to overlook the mountain of corpses in Gaza made me think of Bertolt Brecht's poem, Die Lösung. He wrote it after the defeat of the general strike and uprising in East Berlin in 1953. We had the Stalinist ruling party put up posters around the city saying that to earn back the trust of the party, people would have to work twice as hard. Would it not be simpler, Brecht asks at the end of the poem, for the government to simply dissolve the people and elect another? But of course, I don't need to tell any of you that it's Biden's fault if he chooses Benjamin Netanyahu over his own base and loses a winnable election. A Green Party meeting is probably a single audience that at least needs to hear that. And I don't want to spend my time with you telling you things that you already know. Nor do I think it's particularly useful, to spend it exploring any agreements or disagreements that I may have with you all on questions of electoral strategy. I suspect just about everybody in this room spends more time than I do thinking about electoral strategy. And again, I simply don't want to waste your time. Instead, if you'll indulge me, I want to invite you, comrades, to think with me about a slightly different question. Not a question about means, but a question about ends. Because when we talk about Biden's involvement in proxy wars in the Middle East or Eastern Europe, or the grotesque crackdown he's supporting on students who are taking a stand against genocide on college campuses. I just did a teach-in at Princeton yesterday, and I'm genuinely furious to see the way that these students are being smeared. Or when we talk about the urgent need for action on climate change, or we have any number of similar conversations, what we're really talking about is opposing each new horrible thing when it happens. And of course, those things do need to be opposed, no question. But I worry that we can't build the kind of forces we need to oppose them. And when I say we here, I'm talking about the big lefty we. Everyone from comrades like you guys who are pursuing electoral efforts outside of the two-party system, to comrades in the DSA who are pursuing a different electoral strategy, to the people in those encampments and other efforts that have very little to do with electoral politics one way or the other, all of us. I worry that we won't be able to build up the kinds of cadres we need to get this job done in the long term if we're only reacting to the worst of what's going on right now. If we're just in this kind of eternal defensive posture. I worry about the effects of burnout and demoralization if we're endlessly playing whack-a-mole with each fresh war and we're not driven by a vision of the world that we actually want. If you think back to the best things that happened in the 20th century, like the labor movement that gave so many people I grew up with around in Michigan a chance at a decent life, or the civil rights movement that ended the moral abomination of de jure racial apartheid in the Jim Crow states, or the peace movement that helped end the war in Vietnam. A lot of the people who fought the hardest in the trenches of those movements were socialists and communists who held in their heads a vision of the world that would be totally different than the one we live in right now. That's what kept them going. Mainstream narratives tend to erase them from this history, but these comrades made up a huge part of the background of those movements. And in many cases, when you actually interrogate the specific vision that they held, they thought societies like the Soviet Union or Mao's China represented a viable and desirable alternative to the inequities of the status quo, which was a tragic mistake. We can acknowledge that it was a tragic mistake without portraying those societies that I just mentioned as black and white stories of pure monstrosity. We can don't have to represent them as being like Narnia before Oslo, always winter and never Christmas. And we can acknowledge that there were complex societies that did some things right, and that the free market shock therapy that was applied to many of them starting in the 90s was a giant step backwards. But if we're talking about models of the future that we can get people excited about, we can potentially one day win a majority of the population supporting, we obviously need to do better than to point to the deeply flawed experiments that happened in the 20th century. So here's the question. What do we want? What exactly do we want? Let's say that you could just ask a magical genie to make Bernie Sanders president, or Jill Stein president, or one of those people that we just watched in the Zoom. Noam Chomsky, take your pick. Replace the 535 members of the House and Senate, 535 leftists of your choice. Replace the 9 members of the Supreme Court with 9 of the comrades in this room. If you're imagining that scenario, while you're at it, throw in workers' organizations and people's organizations, the grassroots of society that would be powerful enough to beat back the inevitable attempt by wealthy vested interests to block this government I'm describing from doing what it wanted. If you just help yourself to all of that, what would you actually want that government to do? And before I lay out, my own tentative answers to that question, and then invite you comrades to think about it with me in the Q&A, I want to say a word about why I think it's an important question for us to think about, because it might just seem like a silly waste of time. I'm certainly under zero illusions that the situation I described is likely to come up in the near future. But I think we need an answer because first, I very badly want to believe that there's a better long-term future waiting for us if we can figure out how to implement it. I desperately need to believe that. And second, I think without some kind of vision like that to animate the most dedicated cadres for our movements going forward, I don't believe that we'll be able to achieve reforms on the scale of our predecessors who successfully fought to do things like create collective bargaining and end segregation, never mind creating an entirely new kind of society. History is often very surprising to those who live through it, and I'm sure if we're lucky enough to get to that better society, it won't turn out exactly the way we might predict from the vantage point of 2024, but even so, we need to have some kind of vision of where we want to go to sustain the journey. So again, President Chomsky and 9 of the people in this room in the Supreme Court, wherever you like filling those 535 House and Senate seats, where does that get us? What do we do? Some of it's obvious. Do Medicare for all to end the obscenity of our for-profit healthcare system. We stop shipping 2,000-pound bombs to Israel to drop on children in refugee camps. But then what? Because presumably we don't just want to end those particular horrors and turn America into like a version of Canada with a more dovish foreign policy. Because a more dovish Canada is a fine thing to be. It'd be a nice step from where we are now. But please don't tell me that's the big long-term dream that's supposed to sustain us going forward. Right now, 2 basic things are true, and they'll be true even if we all had healthcare, and even if we ended some of the current wars. And I want to emphasize them just to help us to dream big. One is that we live under capitalism, which is a way of saying that some people own their own businesses, but the overwhelming majority of human beings who are directly involved in the economy have very little autonomy during the hours of the day that they spend making their living. And downstream of that basic inequity in ownership, relations, and economic power, there's an absolutely grotesquely unequal distribution of resources. Some people sleep under bridges and highway overpasses, and some people have private planes, and some people take private space flights, and most people worry about how to handle a $700 emergency. That's obscene. The other thing is that the United States is the reigning imperial hegemon in a global system of domination that takes economic and diplomatic forms, but at its core is the American global projection military force that no one else can rival. That's a kind of system too, a global system of violent unequal power that generates abominations like the decades-long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, like the drone war, like what's going on in Gaza right now, as most of the world looks on in imminent war. I'm pointing to these 2 basic facts about our fundamental economic structure and our fundamental global geopolitical structure to encourage everyone here to think about what it would even look like for those 2 things not to be true. The late analytical Marxist sociologist Eric Wright wrote a book everyone should read called Envisioning Real Utopias, and he says there that we need to ask 3 questions about our vision of a better society. First, we need a vision that's desirable. That is, if we can figure out how we implement it, it would at least be better than what we have right now. It's a low bar, but that's where we start. Second, we need that vision to be viable, meaning that we know how to implement it without recreating the empty grocery store shelves in East Germany or just collapsing back into what we already have right now. Finally, it needs to be achievable, meaning that there's a realistic scenario in which we can win over a democratic majority of the population to our ideas and actually achieve it. So, to start to think about this analytically, an example of a proposal for social change that might be desirable and in some way, viable, but probably would be trying to target racially disparate patterns of poverty with sort of ancestry-based schemes for reparations for slavery. It's very difficult to see how we win over the overwhelming majority of the population that you would need to enact a major distribution of wealth if the major distribution of wealth didn't actually benefit the majority of the population, whereas it's much easier to see how you can win over that overwhelming majority to universalistic ideas about economic distribution, which would help everybody, although of course disproportionately they would help descendants of slaves because of those very disproportionate patterns of the distribution of power. So I want to hear your ideas about this stuff in the Q&A, but first I'll just briefly put my own cards on the table. On foreign policy, on that second question that I was pointing to earlier, beyond winding down the current wars, I think we need to think much harder about how to build kind of multinational institutions that could conceivably be powerful enough to constrain the actions of even the most powerful countries, like Russia, China, but of course, most of all, the United States. I want to negotiate the de-escalation of Ukraine, for example, because I think that's the least possible, least awful outcome that I could imagine under present circumstances. But ultimately, I would like a global system where somebody like Putin would worry that if he initiated a war without justification, then he would end up being hauled before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And I would want a global system where an American president would worry that if they did something like invade Iraq or send 2,000-pound bombs to Israel to drop on refugee camps, they would end up sharing that jail cell. Now, right now we can barely even imagine what functional global institutions that had teeth like that would or could even look like. It's so far from where we are right now. Never mind the steps that would take us from here to there. I do know, for example, that a good baby step in that direction would be repealing the absurd law on books right now in the United States that commits us to engage in military action, not making this up, to rescue any American military officers who find themselves on trial before the International Criminal Court. That sounds made up, but it's not. Act, but it's officially called the American Service Members Protection Act. It was passed in 2002. On the economic front, what we think very hard about is what Alex Nove called feasible socialism. What that means is some form of socialism that would do away with all the worst things about the capitalist status quo. Not all of them, I'm sure, no system does away with all of them, but a whole bunch of them, I would hope. But would it generate the kind of economic dysfunctionality on the other end that would breed so much discontent that either capitalism would be restored the way it ultimately was in the USSR, or you would need some sort of severe political authoritarianism to stop that from happening, which the Soviet experience shows is just a stopgap anyway. If half of our reason for hating capitalism is that democracy stops at the gates of the workplace, then we need an economically viable vision of socialism so that it can be an expansion of democracy, not a contraction. I think my friend Bhaskar Sankara has some plausible things to say about that. In the first chapter of his book, The Socialist Manifesto, it's called Day in the Life of a Socialist Citizen. I think the philosopher David Schweikart had some plausible things to say about in his books, After Capitalism. The bad news, if you read these thinkers, is that we probably don't know yet how to do without markets entirely. Maybe one day AI will advance to the point that we can have, fully automated luxury communism. But I don't want to have to wait for that to start envisioning a post-capitalist future. I want a vision that we could, at least in principle, implement tomorrow, even if God only knows when we get there in the real world. So I think we probably do need market mechanisms in some parts of the economy for the foreseeable future, but for sure we know we can centrally plan sectors like healthcare and education outside of that, because the experience of actually existing social democracy around the world is pretty definitive on that. Canada exists. You can drive up and verify for yourself. And I think thinkers like Sankara and Schweikart have ideas that are worth exploring about how, if we need market mechanisms in some parts of the economy, at least the firms in those parts of the economy could be internally democratic worker-owned firms. And instead of private investment, the funds for new firms could come from state-owned banks. And I know that once you start talking about firm structure and how investment capital is seeded, this can start to feel very dry, very unexciting, but it shouldn't. Honestly, this stuff excites me because it's a vision that I can just about imagine actually happening. I can just about imagine a timeline where we actually do eventually get there. Achieving a process that sure might have to include moments of dramatic rupture, general strikes, factory occupations, things like that. But I can imagine actually electing left-wing politicians and having them do things that start to get us in that direction. I think, for example, about Jeremy Corbyn's proposal several years ago that at firms that are about to relocate out of the country or go out of business, the workers themselves be given right of first refusal to buy up the firm with government-seeded funds. That's something that I think if you explain it to most normies, they'll say, oh yeah, that sounds good, right? People who are about to get laid off have a chance at keeping their jobs and seeing if they can run the place themselves. And again, it at least points in the direction of that better economy that I'm talking about. And ultimately, I guess the stuff excites me because these are the kind of ideas, this and the foreign policy ones we're talking about, that at least give me some kind of glimpse of what something qualitatively better than the current American system and the current global system might look like. And I think we desperately need a vision like that if we're going to sustain ourselves in the current game of whack-a-mole and not burn out as we see horror upon horror pile up all around us. And with that, I'd like to hear from you guys.
All right. So I also actually the day after I got back, I did the Munk debates, MUNK. They had they hosted a debate. We did it online. They'll put it out audio only. Between me and Jamie Kirchik, who used to work for the New Republic, on the resolved the campus protests around the right side of history. So with any luck, we'll have that for you as part of next week's show. I will also, I guess, say that was originally going to be a debate with Jonah Goldberg, and Jonah said he realized that he was busy. So, who knows? But, Mr. Goldberg, if you ever want to, reschedule outside of Monk's auspices, the door is open. So I'll just say that. But in any case, so while we are wrapping up, I also know we have so we have this from Andy. You want to give us the context for this?
Yeah, so I mentioned the post game last week that I was part of the Pride March with my local DSA and marched for Gaza, marched for the Palestinians, and spent the entire time chanting, Genocide Joe, and from the river to the sea. It was a lot of fun. And the wonderful thing about it is that the crowds warmly welcomed us. Like there was cheering, from most corners. I would have to say. I think I saw one person purposely stood with their back to us, but I think outside of that, there was a lot of signs that actually, said, I'm gay and I'm for a free Palestine kind of stuff in the crowd. So I thought that was great. So it was just an absolute wonderful experience, and that is both my DSA and the Berkshire's DSA, who was part of the march. So that was a picture we took after the march.
Yeah, I know this is the kind of thing that there's this talking point that a lot of people seem to be very proud of themselves for, which is oh, how could you possibly be gay and for Palestine because Hamas kills gay people or you're out of the closet and all this stuff, and it's like always strikes me as this massive non sequitur.
Well, not only that, like just to put it on the surface, this weekend, Eurovision happened.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Eurovision, and Israel competed, which they got booed.
Yep.
Was a wonderful thing to see. But I did not actually watch that Eurovision. I just saw some clips from it. And of course, Windows 95 man. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up on YouTube. Thank me later. But the one thing, they had Israel had a non-binary performer, and they misgendered their performer, and I think might have dead named them if I remember correctly. But I know they definitely misgendered them. So like Israel's not this bastion of liberal gay rights that they're making it out.
I mean, certainly not. I mean, there's no same-sex marriage in Israel, but I mean, you could make the point, which is fair enough as far as it goes, that it's still much more liberal on that than Hamas. But like, again, it just seems like a huge non sequitur to me, because you can search the pronouncements of Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir in vain for any indication that they even pretend that they're like fighting to impose social liberalism on people in Gaza, right? That has nothing to do with anything. They've never made the slightest attempt to do that in a Palestinian territory or to make life better for any gay person there. And I would, obviously, I always, sort of say, half jokingly, just because I think it plays up the absurdity of all the do you condemn Hamas stuff, that obviously people would not have my vote if I could somehow vote in a Palestinian election, but obviously I would hope for vastly more progressive forces to win out, in the future. But meanwhile, I think what would be really nice for people in Gaza, closeted gay people or otherwise, is to not die and not have their children die. And that really seems like that should be the priority at the moment. I also think, by the way, I also say on Eurovision, I mean, it's like, you could say, okay, it's not the performer's fault, that the policies of their government, etc. And I'm actually sympathetic to that. But the problem is that Eurovision does make decisions all the time that are geopolitical decisions about who gets to participate and who doesn't, right? So, bring the Russians back in Eurovision, right? And then we can just say, hey, everybody, this has nothing to do with politics, whatever. But of course, you can't really have that both ways. Before we close out, if I could find it, I just did want to do the very last question in the Q&A. Let me see if I can grab this.
Has to do with, in a sense, quote unquote infrastructure, where our message is stepped on over and over and over again, because those that are reporting the message, if you will, are owned by ones who are suppressing the people themselves. And my question to you is, what step do you think we could take so that the message of the rest of a large portion of the country can be heard, as opposed to the corporate message that we get stuffed down our throat every single day? Okay, because there are certain things, my personal belief, there are certain human rights that people have: a roof over your head, food on the table, the right to believe whatever you want to believe, etc., and live your lifestyle the way you want to live. And all of those under capitalism are squashed. I just wanted to ask you about that.
Sure. So I have two versions of the answer to this. There's a 3-word version, and there's the slightly longer version. So the slightly longer version is that I think in the past, when the kind of issue that you're talking about has been at least partially overcome in some kind of successful way, a lot of that is about sort of the kind of organizations in workplaces and communities that can do person-to-person messaging rather than everybody all at once. And I think the importance of that really can't be overstated, right? I think it's too easy everybody here is already several steps past most people who share their opinions because they're actually doing things like going to meetings in physical space. And sadly, most people who agree with all of us on all those issues that I just mentioned aren't doing right now, right? And I think that if you have, like I was sort of alluding to at the beginning of the talk, workers' organizations, people's organizations that can spread that kind of person-to-person messaging, I think there's really no substitute for that. That said, especially if this is the last question, I've got to give my 3-word answer too. So you asked, how do we overcome the domination of corporate media, and all the propaganda we're seeing, right? I just had a wonderful discussion yesterday. When I did that teach-in with a bunch of very earnest Princeton students, lots of whom were Jewish, none of whom seemed to love Hamas. You would not know these things from cable news. And it was wonderful. The disconnect between that and what you see on there is horrifying, right? The way these people are being demonized. So, as I said, I think the more complicated and fuller answer to how do we overcome that problem is the one I just gave. But I feel duty bound to give the 3-word answer, which is subscribe to Jacobin. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.